I thought I knew the man I was going to marry, but 3 months before our wedding, he dropped a bombshell that shattered everything I believed about love. The conversation started innocently enough. We were sitting on our couch, wedding magazines scattered across the coffee table, when he suddenly got this serious look on his face. He cleared his throat and told me he had something important to discuss. My heart started racing because his tone was so formal, so unlike the playful guy I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. He explained that he'd been thinking about our wedding photos and how they'd be displayed for years to come. Then came the words that felt like a punch to my stomach. He needed me to lose at least 30 pounds before our wedding day, or he'd have to reconsider our entire relationship. He said it wasn't about loving me less, but about wanting a bride he could be proud to show off to his family and friends. I sat there in complete shock. At 5'6" and 150 pounds, I'd never considered myself overweight. Sure, I wasn't the same size I was in college, but I felt healthy and confident in my own skin. I worked out regularly, ate reasonably well, and had always received compliments about my appearance. But there he was, the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally, telling me I wasn't good enough as I was. The worst part was how calculated it all seemed. He pulled out his phone and showed me diet plans he'd researched, gym memberships he'd looked into, and even before and after photos of other women who'd lost weight for their weddings. He'd clearly been planning this conversation for weeks, maybe months, while I'd been blissfully unaware that my body was apparently a source of embarrassment for him. I tried to respond calmly, asking him where this was coming from. He insisted it wasn't personal, that he just wanted us both to look our best on our special day. But when I pressed him further, the truth started coming out. His mother had made comments about my weight at our engagement party. His college friends had apparently made jokes about him settling down with someone who wasn't as thin as his ex-girlfriends. The more he talked, the more I realized this wasn't about health or looking good in photos. This was about his own insecurities and need for validation from others. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of our relationship, looking for signs I'd missed. Had he always felt this way about my body? Were there subtle hints I'd ignored? I remembered times when he'd suggested we order salads instead of pasta, or when he'd make comments about other women's figures while we watched movies together. Little things that seemed harmless at the time now felt loaded with judgment. The next few days were torture. I found myself obsessing over every bite of food, standing sideways in mirrors, and Googling crash diets at 2 in the morning. I even went to a department store and tried on wedding dresses in smaller sizes, torturing myself with the image of who I apparently needed to become to be worthy of marrying the man I loved. But something else was happening too. The more I thought about his ultimatum, the angrier I became. I started paying attention to how he interacted with me in public, and I noticed things I'd somehow overlooked before. The way he'd position himself slightly in front of me in group photos. How he'd change the subject when his friends asked about wedding planning. The fact that he'd never posted a full-body photo of us together on his social media, despite having hundreds of pictures on his phone. Update 1. 2 weeks into what I'd privately started calling my humiliation diet, something unexpected happened. I was at the grocery store, carefully selecting organic vegetables and lean proteins, when I ran into my college roommate. We hadn't seen each other in over a year, and she immediately noticed something was off. She insisted we grab coffee right there in the store's little cafe area. I found myself spilling everything to her, the ultimatum, the diet plans, the way I'd been weighing myself twice a day and calculating calories obsessively. She listened without interrupting, but I could see the horror growing on her face. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before asking me a question that hit like lightning. If my best friend came to me with this exact same story, what would I tell her to do? The answer was immediate and clear, but saying it out loud felt impossible. I'd tell her to run. I'd tell her that anyone who truly loved her would never make their love conditional on her changing her body. I'd tell her that this was just the beginning, that someone who would manipulate her this way before marriage would only get worse after the wedding. Driving home from that coffee meeting, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of going straight home, I drove to the wedding venue. I sat in the parking lot and called the coordinator to ask about cancellation policies. I wasn't ready to actually cancel anything yet, but I needed to know what my options were. The conversation was surprisingly comforting. She'd seen situations like this before and assured me that whatever I decided, they'd work with me. That evening, when my fiancé asked about my day and complimented me on the healthy dinner I'd prepared, I felt like I was watching someone else's life. Here was this man who claimed to love me, praising me for starving myself to meet his arbitrary standards. I realized I'd lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks, and instead of feeling proud, I felt hollow and defeated. I started paying closer attention to our relationship dynamics. I noticed how he'd subtly redirect conversations when they touched on topics where I had strong opinions that differed from his. How he'd make decisions about our social calendar without consulting me, then present them as done deals. How he'd somehow convinced me that his preferences were more valid than mine in almost every aspect of our shared life. The breaking point came during a family dinner at his parents' house. His mother made what she probably thought was a helpful comment about how much progress I was making with my wedding prep, gesturing vaguely at my body. His father chimed in with some joke about how marriage would be good motivation for me to stay in shape. The whole table laughed, including my fiancé, while I sat there feeling completely mortified. But then his teenage sister, who'd always been quiet during family gatherings, spoke up. She said something that changed everything. She mentioned how excited she was that her brother had finally found someone who made him laugh like I did, and how she'd never seen him as happy as he'd been since we got together. She talked about how I'd helped him become more confident and outgoing, how I'd encouraged him to pursue hobbies he'd given up, and how much more fun he was to be around since we'd started dating. Her words hit me like a revelation. I'd been so focused on what I apparently lacked that I'd forgotten what I brought to our relationship. I'd forgotten that I was the one who encouraged him to reconnect with old friends, who supported him through a career change, who'd helped him work through his anxiety about social situations. I'd forgotten that relationships were supposed to be about mutual growth and support, not about one person molding the other into their ideal image. Update 2. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made a decision that scared me but felt absolutely right. I was going to have one final conversation with my fiancé, but this time I was going to be the one setting the terms. I asked him to meet me at the park where we'd had our first date. It felt symbolic somehow, going back to the beginning when things were pure and uncomplicated between us. I'd prepared what I wanted to say, but when I saw him walking toward me with that familiar smile, my heart broke a little. This was the man I'd planned to spend my life with, and part of me still wanted to believe we could work through this. I started by telling him about my conversation with his sister and how it had made me realize something important. I explained that over the past few weeks, I'd lost sight of who I was and what I brought to our relationship. I'd been so focused on trying to change myself to meet his expectations that I'd forgotten to ask whether his expectations were reasonable or fair. Then I told him about my own ultimatum. I explained that I needed him to think seriously about why my weight mattered so much to him, and whether he was prepared to love and support me through all the changes our bodies would inevitably go through over the course of a lifetime together. I gave him 1 week to decide whether he wanted to marry me as I was, or whether he wanted to find someone who better fit his image of an ideal wife. His reaction was not what I expected. Instead of getting defensive or angry, he broke down crying. He admitted that the pressure had never really been about my weight, it had been about his own fears of not being good enough for me. His ex-girlfriend had been very thin and conventionally attractive, but their relationship had been toxic and emotionally abusive. When we got together, he felt like he'd won the lottery, but as our wedding approached, his insecurities had gotten the better of him. He confessed that his friends had made comments, not about my weight, but about how I was out of his league. They'd joked that he'd better lock me down quickly before I realized I could do better. His mother's comments hadn't been about my appearance either. She'd been worried that I was too independent and successful, that I might not need him the way his father needed her. The more he talked, the more I understood that his ultimatum had been a twisted attempt to level the playing field. If he could convince me that I needed to change to be worthy of him, then maybe he wouldn't have to face his own feelings of inadequacy. It was cruel and manipulative, but it came from a place of deep insecurity rather than malice. This revelation created a new problem. On one hand, I understood his fears and could empathize with his insecurities. On the other hand, the damage was done. He'd made me question my own worth and beauty, had made me feel like I needed to earn his love through self-denial and change. Even if his motivations were understandable, the impact on me had been devastating. We spent hours talking that day. He apologized profusely and begged me to forgive him. He promised to work on his insecurities and swore that he'd never ask me to change anything about myself again. But I realized that trust, once broken in such a fundamental way, couldn't be rebuilt with promises and apologies. I told him I needed time to think, really think, about whether I could move forward in a relationship where my partner had been willing to hurt me so deeply because of his own fears. I explained that even though I understood his motivations, I wasn't sure I could ever feel secure in his love again. How could I trust that the next time he felt insecure, he wouldn't find another way to tear me down to build himself up? Final update. The week that followed was the hardest of my life. I moved in temporarily with my college roommate, needing space to think clearly without the constant presence of our shared apartment and all the wedding planning materials that seemed to mock me from every surface. I spent a lot of time writing, not just processing my feelings, but really examining what I wanted from a life partner. I made lists of the qualities that mattered to me, the kind of relationship I wanted to build, and the non-negotiables I needed to honor for my own well-being. The exercise was painful but illuminating. What became clear was that while I could forgive my fiancé for his moment of weakness, I couldn't forget the willingness he'd shown to sacrifice my happiness for his own comfort. More troubling was the realization that this hadn't been an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern of subtle manipulation and control that I'd been too in love to recognize. I also had to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. I'd been so eager to be the perfect girlfriend, and then fiancé, that I'd gradually given up pieces of myself along the way. I'd stopped hanging out with friends he didn't particularly like. I'd changed my style to match his preferences. I'd even started watching his shows and listening to his music instead of exploring my own interests. The weight loss ultimatum hadn't happened in a vacuum, it was the culmination of 3 years of slowly shrinking myself to fit into his vision of who I should be. The scary part was how gradual and seemingly reasonable each individual compromise had seemed at the time. During that week, something beautiful happened. Without the stress of trying to lose weight quickly, without the constant anxiety about measuring up to someone else's standards, I started feeling like myself again. I went to yoga classes I enjoyed instead of punishing gym sessions focused on burning calories. I ate foods that nourished me instead of restricting myself to lettuce and lean protein. I called friends I'd neglected and remembered how much I enjoyed their company. My ex-fiancé called and texted constantly during this time, alternating between desperate apologies and frustrated demands that I stop being dramatic and come home. The shift between these two modes was telling. When gentle manipulation didn't work, he'd resort to anger and blame. It confirmed what I was already starting to understand about our dynamic. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt both devastating and liberating. I met him at a neutral location, a coffee shop near his office, and told him I couldn't marry him. I explained that while I believed his apologies were sincere, and while I understood that his behavior had come from his own pain and insecurity, I couldn't build a life with someone who had shown he was willing to hurt me to manage his own feelings. His reaction was explosive. He accused me of throwing away 3 years over one mistake, of being unforgiving and cruel. He said I was making the biggest error of my life, that I'd never find anyone who loved me as much as he did. In that moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw clearly who he really was underneath all the charm and romantic gestures. The man who truly loved me would never have asked me to lose weight for his comfort. The man who truly loved me would never have made me feel like I needed to earn his affection through self-improvement. And the man who truly loved me certainly wouldn't be screaming at me in a coffee shop because I'd chosen my own well-being over his convenience. Canceling the wedding was logistically complicated but emotionally straightforward. Some vendors were understanding, others less so, but the financial losses seemed insignificant compared to what I would have lost if I'd gone through with marrying someone who saw me as a project to be improved rather than a person to be cherished. The months that followed were a journey of rediscovering myself. I threw myself into hobbies I'd abandoned, reconnected with friends who'd drifted away during my relationship, and started making decisions based purely on what I wanted rather than what would make someone else happy. 6 months after calling off the wedding, I ran into him at a mutual friend's party. He'd started dating someone new, a woman who was exactly the type he'd apparently always wanted, thin and quiet and eager to please. She looked at him with the same adoring expression I probably used to wear, and I felt a mixture of sadness for her and gratitude for my escape. He tried to talk to me that night, probably expecting some kind of jealous reaction or regret. Instead, I felt nothing but relief. I looked at this man who had once held such power over my self-esteem and saw him clearly for the first time, insecure, controlling, and ultimately small. I realized that the version of love he'd offered me had never been love at all, but rather possession dressed up in romantic language. A year later, I'm in a completely different place. I've learned to recognize red flags I used to ignore, to trust my instincts when something feels off, and to value my own opinion of myself more than anyone else's. I've discovered what it feels like to be truly comfortable in my own skin, not because I've changed my body, but because I've changed my relationship with it. I still don't know if I'll get married someday, but I know that if I do, it will be to someone who sees my supposed flaws as just more reasons to love me. Someone who makes me feel more myself, not less. Someone who would never dream of asking me to change the fundamental parts of who I am for their comfort or convenience. The weight I needed to lose was never the 30 pounds my ex-fiancé demanded. It was the 180 pounds of dead weight I was carrying around in the form of someone who claimed to love me but was really just trying to control me. Losing that weight was the best thing I ever did for my health, my happiness, and my future. Looking back, I'm grateful for his ultimatum, as cruel as it was at the time. It forced me to confront truths about our relationship that I might have ignored for years otherwise. It made me stronger, more self-aware, and ultimately led me to a much better life than the one I would have had as his wife. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be exactly what you needed to save yourself from something even worse. I thought I was losing the love of my life, but what I actually lost was someone who never truly loved me at all.